In case you missed my review of the Quatermass experiment, let me just say it is one of the most consequential British sci-fi horrors ever made, and it served as a launching point for Hammer Films to begin its long embrace with the horror genre. That makes it an incredibly hard act to follow, so today we're going to talk about its first sequel, the ingeniously named Quatermass 2, and answer the question, can any movie live up to the Quatermass name? Maybe I'll even refrain from mispronouncing the name Brian Donlevy.
Brian Dunleavy.
Oh, sorry, Brian Dunleavy. We'll also discuss how the original creator of the entire Quatermass series got a chance to work on the movie only to later try to erase it from existence. And then I'll try to pretend I know anything about British culture and politics of the 1950s when I start analyzing it. Yes, you heard me right, I said the P word again. So strap in, because there's much to discuss.
Inside those domes are creatures from outside this earth. Ah, you man! I've seen them!
On the brink of launching an atomic rocket to lay the groundwork for a human colony on the moon, Professor Bernard Quatermass learns that the British government is ceasing its funding of the project. At the same time, he begins to unravel a tangled conspiracy around anomalous objects falling from outer space, a government project in a hidden-away town, people apparently succumbing to mind control, and a bureaucratic maze of secrecy that may involve Quatermass himself. Can the professor find the truth in time, or is the world already in mortal peril from something nobody can see?
In 1955, the BBC, following the establishment of broadcast competition in the ITV network, extended its contract with writer Nigel Kneale, in large part due to the success of the television serial The Quatermass Experiment. Kneale, worried about things like shadowy government research in Porton Down and the fact that Kneale himself had been forced to sign the Official Secrets Act, decided to center his story on a government conspiracy, which, because it was Quatermass, had to involve aliens. Airing just 1 month after Hammer's film adaptation of the original, Quatermass 2 was a big hit for the BBC. Meanwhile, Hammer, having been forced to alter the film X the Unknown to not be its own Quatermass sequel, negotiated for the film rights to Quatermass 2, this time giving Kneale the opportunity to write the screenplay himself. As such, his script for Quatermass 2 is more faithful to the source material, though it does make a few changes in the interests of a condensed time frame. By the way, the title of the television serial uses the Roman numeral II, whereas the film version uses the standard Western Arabic numeral II. The never-reliable IMDb trivia page says this makes Quatermass 2, the film, the first sequel to use an Arabic numeral, but I obviously can't independently verify that. If you're not confused though, some of the original posters for the film use the Roman numeral by mistake. America would deal with all this inconsistency by just releasing it as Enemy from Space instead. Val Guest returned to the director's chair, and he made some alterations to Kneale's script. His final draft of the screenplay still sticks relatively close to the broadcast version, and with Hammer securing a budget of £90,000 to £92,000, over twice the budget of the first film, cameras began rolling in 1956. However, there was one thing that Guest did, not related to the script, that infuriated Nigel Kneale to no end. The subject of today's video was voted on by my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to vote on future topics, get ad-free versions of my videos, or just want to show your appreciation because I'm so awesome, consider joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. I'd like to give a special shout out to my $8 androids: Batty Bat Firebrand, Chuck Poor, Diane McGill Davis, Don Quixote, Giffen Chumley DDF, Jack Blair, John Burrell, Mike O'Connor, Patrick Baker, Robert McGill, Spoats, Tracy Rothmyers, and Warren Davis. Thank you all for your support. To play Professor Bernard Quatermass, they rehired the American Brian Dunleavy. Nigel Neal would be so incensed by this decision that he would claim Dunleavy to be an impossible drunkard who couldn't remember his lines and had no idea what was going on set. Director Val Guest would push back on this characterization, though he did admit that Dunleavy had a tendency to lace his coffee in the morning. If you ask me, the truth of the matter is probably closer to Guest's account, because nobody but Neal ever complained about Dunleavy's behind-the-scenes behavior during Quatermass 2. We'll get back to Nigel Neal a bit later, but trust me when I say he never got over the casting of Brian Dunleavy in the title role. Due to his stage schedule, Jack Warner was unavailable to return as Inspector Lomax, so the role instead went to veteran British actor John Longdon. Similarly, Maurice Kaufman wasn't able to return as Marsh, and was replaced by Brian Forbes. John Ray was the only actor to play the same character in both versions of Quatermass 2, in his case the character of McLeod, and character actor Sid James lends a little comedy to the role of Jimmy Hall.
Hey, General.
Jimmy, what do you want?
1.5 color.
Not now, Jimmy. I'm
Quatermass, the Rocket Man. Elephant Hole remembered.
Regular viewers of this channel might recognize John Van Issen, who would go on to play Jonathan Harker in Hammer's Dracula, and Percy Herbert, who would sport an interesting American accent in Mysterious Island.
I can bring you down, but not necessarily alive. The way this wind is running, we'd be smashed to a pulp when we hit land.
In addition to filming at Hammer's Bray Studios and at New Elstree Studios, location shooting was done at the Shellhaven Oil Refinery in Essex, which had also been used for the television version, at the town of Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire, at the South Downs near Brighton, at Trafalgar Square, and in the House of Lords, wherein Quatermass 2 was the first film to be shot. Director Val Guest once again utilized cinema verite to ground the more fantastic elements of the plot, and the shoot was relatively uneventful. One sequence that did take a lot more effort than anticipated, though, was the moment when Vincent Broadhead, played by Tom Chatto, emerges from the alien dome drenched in black goo. During the multiple retakes, Chatto, whose wife happened to be the casting director, dryly stated, "Remind me to talk to my wife about casting me in this." Quatermass 2 released in the UK in May of 1957, the same month as Hammer's The Curse of Frankenstein. It then released in America under the title Enemy from Space in September. Reviews were lukewarm in both places, though much praise was heaped on Val Guest and the film's faithfulness to the source material, and it did decent numbers at the box office. However, the dramatic success of The Curse of Frankenstein muted Quatermass 2's reception, ultimately convincing Hammer to put more effort into their retelling of the Universal classic horrors than into Val Guest's more contemplative sci-fi films. The fact that horror is typically cheaper to produce was probably a big influence as well. Therefore, Hammer was in no hurry to jump on the third Quatermass serial, 1958's Quatermass and the Pit, which didn't see a film adaptation until 1967. Another wrinkle was Nigel Neal. See, I promised we'd get back to him. He absolutely loathed the film adaptation of Quatermass 2, and when the rights to release the film reverted back to him, he refused to let it be rebroadcast on television for over a decade, and didn't allow it to be released on home video until 2003. Unlike Neal, though, I think this movie serves as a fantastic sequel. I don't consider it as groundbreaking or innovative as the original Quatermass experiment, but the increased budget and tighter pacing make for a much more polished experience, or at least as polished as a Hammer film could get in those days. And as much as Nigel Neal hated Brian Dunleavy, I happen to love him. As I said in my original Quatermass review, Dunleavy is the best on-screen version of the Professor, and no, I'm not just saying that because of national pride. If I have any real complaint about the story, it would be its reliance on coincidence, like Quatermass just happening to come across one of the victims, or the alien biodomes just happening to look exactly like Quatermass's moon plan. But I'm willing to forgive all that, because the climax features a trio of Lovecraftian kaiju monsters that put Hedera to shame. All that said, you guys know me, and you know that if there's one thing that'll make me fall in love with a story, it's the potential for over-analysis. Quatermass 2 is a perfect example of this because it is a uniquely British take on the Aliens Among Us trope popularized in America the year before with Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Going all the way back to H.G. Wells, alien invasion stories set in England tend to draw analogies to British colonialism. Wells himself wanted to hold a mirror up to his fellow countrymen and say, "This is what it feels like when we intrude upon other nation-states." Quatermass 2 may not be as direct in its commentary as The War of the Worlds, but the idea is still there, only in the context of a post-World War II, post-colonial age. By the 1950s, the United Kingdom was facing an identity crisis, no longer pursuing empire and no longer considered the prime superpower. Take, for example, the Suez Crisis, in which Britain, along with France and Israel, invaded Egypt with the goal of deposing the president and taking back control of the Suez Canal. To make a long story short, the invasion was halted after both the United States and the Soviet Union exerted political pressure, which was demoralizing to Britain and her allies, who had just learned that they couldn't pursue their own international interests without permission. I've come across commentary that suggests this is what Nigel Kneale had in mind when he wrote Quatermass 2, but the timeline doesn't work out. Kneale wrote the original Quatermass 2, the television version, over a year before the Suez Crisis began. Nevertheless, the crisis is illustrative of the tensions within English society, and it is all too easy to suggest that the aliens in Quatermass 2 are less representative of the British themselves and more of the global forces stripping the United Kingdom of its autonomy. In other words, the aliens are America. Not only does this go a long way towards explaining Kneale's animosity towards an American Quatermass, but it also reflects the conundrum of a British company, Hammer Films, being forced to make deals with Americans in order to make money. Quatermass shows frustration with the British government's unwillingness to fund his project or acknowledge what he knows is happening, and so you could argue that the Professor, with the aid of Vincent Broadhead, is fighting the British government's bureaucratic obstinacy as much, if not more so, than he is fighting the alien menace. Now, I grant that I say all of this as an outsider myself, and one who only lived through about a decade of the Cold War. That disclaimed, I still think this is the best way to understand Quatermass 2's underlying messages. It's a movie about cultural identity in a world that seems to be spinning faster than ever, about a scientist who sees his noble goals thwarted by interference both foreign and domestic, about unhealthy nostalgia for wartime industrialization, and about a nation that is learning to cope with a more submissive role on the world stage. Like I said, I do love it when I can overanalyze something. Needless to say, I'm here to report that Quatermass 2 is not only a great sequel, but it's also a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Which Quatermass movie is your favorite? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll mix Soylent Green, Short Circuit, and Friday the 13th, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Look out!